Hey, and welcome to Grade 3 of the Carrot Poker School. Lecture 1 is all about mixing, and mixing is an important concept to get accustomed to when you become a bit more advanced at poker. Mixing simply means alternating between different actions in the same spot at certain frequencies. Mixing is only okay when actions are expected to have roughly the same EV, to the point you can't really tell what's better. And mixing is only necessary when you're in a game with relatively high visibility, where people can see maybe your HUD stats or your strategy, take notes on you, or observe your tendencies in a live setting. Mixing is important because it takes the pressure off. Rather than driving yourself crazy by thinking, should I bet here, should I check? If you can identify the spots in which the baseline suggests that either play is okay, not only can you deviate very easily by identifying some factors that might make one play better than the other in reality, but you can also just feel confident and content that by using an RNG or some alternative means, that you can take either option without too much worry. Today, we're going to start by looking at facing bets and mixing between the options of call, raise, and fold. This means identifying hands that are mixes and hands that aren't, trying to learn when are actions pure and when are they just optional, but also looking a little bit at frequencies, and as this is grade 3, how to put together a bit more of a succinct and precise strategy that allows for minimal counter exploitation on our opponent's behalf. So let's get started. We're going to begin with the turn, call, fold, and difference point in the following situation. This is a big blind versus cutoff matchup, single raise pot. Big blind checks and cutoff decides to bet all of their range for 33% pot, which is an okay strategy. You could also bet just most of your range for 33% pot, or you could bet a bit less of your range for a larger sizing. That would be okay as well. 7 of diamonds turn comes, and we check and face a B75 barrel. A very common and standard sort of line. We could also have faced an overbet here, as you'll know from previous grades of the Carrot Poker School, or just from your own level of ability if you're starting at grade 3. That would be fine, but many people will simplify to using this sizing, and it's big blind's decision point against this. Our main point here is that when we face a turn barrel in equilibrium, we will have a large cluster of hands that are close to 0 EV to call with. This would not be the case against the maniac who is barreling way too wide with air and just bluffing at too high of a frequency, nor would it be the case against a nittier player who's under bluffing. But against someone competent and roughly balancing their bluff to value ratio in the correct way, we're going to be indifferent with many of our hands, or at least too indifferent to be able to tell whether call or fold is better. There will also be situations where we can raise, but for now we're just going to look at indifference between calling and folding. It will be useful to identify 2 separate indifference points, as we saw in grade 2 with respect to our calling range. If this seems unfamiliar, you might want to go back and have a look at thresholds in grade 2 lecture 7, provided that you've done that course. We have one threshold for made hands. This is called the robustness threshold from grade 2, and this pertains to hands that are on the cusp between calling and folding, and if they call, it's mainly because they already have sufficient showdown value to win frequently without having to either improve or risk further money on the river as a bluff. We also touched on a threshold for draws, which we call the frailness threshold, and this will pertain to hands that can call, but they're deriving much of their EV from actually improving, or maybe bluffing, but not so much in this spot where we're out of position, and if we call turn, we'll be procedurally just checking most of our range on most rivers. Here are some guided questions to get us started for today. Where is our indifference or mixing point? This is one and the same thing, bearing in mind that the solver is never going to mix if it thinks one option is better than the other. So when I say indifference and mixing, it's basically substitutable. So where is this with respect to our made hands in our range? In other words, at what point does a made hand in our range become 0 EV to call and therefore mixable between call and fold, and actually becomes a good idea to mix in order to keep a rough balance to your strategy so that you're not over defending or under defending, thus not incentivizing villain to overbluff or underbluff. And secondly, where is our indifference mixing point with call and fold with respect to hands that are more likely to derive their EV from draws and improving? What do you think about our worst flush draws? Are they continuable here? Why? Why not? Thirdly, how does having a diamond affect the EV of calling a pocket pair? Imagine you had a hand like 5s with a diamond. Would that be better than 5s without a diamond? Why or why not? I'm going to let you pause the video now and have a look at these 4 questions, the final one being rank the following hands from highest to lowest EV calls. Pause the video. I'll assume you've done that and you've now unpaused and you've written down some answers, and we're going to go over the answers. Here are the solutions. Our indifference mixing point for hands that are deriving their EV from showdown value already is something like 6s with no diamond. I won't talk too much about what sixes with a diamond is doing because I'm going to get to that in point 3. To understand why this hand is roughly indifferent, the idea is that when cutoff has bet all of their range on the flop, a hand that has this much showdown value and robustness is still going to be reasonable to call with on a fairly wide range confrontation against this sizing. If villain upped the sizing to overbet, this would no longer be the case, and if villain had been more selective on the flop, this call would also be more dubious. The 7 is not a good card for big blind's range, the idea being that while cutoff doesn't have a lot of 7x, big blind is going to shed their 7x very frequently on the flop. I can't actually think of a card that gets folded more than a 7 as it relates to unpaired hands. The 7 isn't the best card for big blind. It's not as bad as certain cards like a queen, 9, 8, or 10, which are going to hit cutoff more frequently, or a king, but the 7 is definitely down there on the list of neutral to bad turn cards. We do need to be a little bit more careful on this card than we would be on a deuce with respect to just the absolute hand strength that we're calling, but overall 6s is still going to be okay against this sizing. We're not going to block too many bluffs with this hand. We are going to have a bit more robustness against hands like 5-4 or something like that, or ace-4, ace-5, which are only going to have one overcard now. Contrast that to us having a pair of deuces, where they could have more, or a pair of 4s, and so this hand is roughly the threshold. It's good to remember this, because you'll face this strategy of range bet flop b75 turn very often, and you'll want to know roughly where the cutoff point is. We've discussed range geography before in the Carrot Poker School, and that's the idea that if you know one of the landmarks of your range, i.e. 6s being a mix here, then you can infer that all 7x and pocket 8s are just likely to be calls, because they're much better hands. Question 2. A hand like this is plus EV to call. The solver prefers raising this particular combo, but it does give us an idea of what's going on here to look at the call EV. So while the solver is recommending pure raise, that doesn't mean we can't garner a lot of useful information by considering that call is better than fold. This verdict that you could call this hand before you would fold it is confusing to some. The idea is actually that there's a non-0% of the time that you can win with queen high, assuming that your opponent doesn't always follow through a hand like 9-8 on the river. They will frequently, they may not always. Secondly, you can hit a pair of queens or 5s. Thirdly, you have implied odds, obviously to raise the river or call over bets on diamonds. And there's just enough going on here that there's just more to it than simply requiring X equity. You have other things going on except equity, because this is not an end of action spot. Question 3. Having a diamond makes the EV of calling much better. Much better could be an exaggeration, but 4s without a diamond is losing 1.22 chips here. This is a 5-10 game, so that's like losing a tenth of a big blind by calling, whereas calling with the diamond doesn't lose anything. How to understand this? Some people get this wrong because they think, doesn't the 4 of diamonds block bluffs? Yes, but only a few. And these bluffs are quite high EV anyway, they're entitled to a lot of the pot, and therefore it's not really such a big deal that you block bluffs. It's not a bad thing to block ace-4 of diamonds. Ace-4 of diamonds is a pretty good hand in your opponent's range. The thing you'd want to unblock would be hands like ace-4 no diamond, and 4s with a diamond actually unblocks that lower EV draw more. But blockers aside, because they're not the most important aspect of this, 4s with a diamond has a lot more equity and a lot more EV, and the reason for that is if you river a set, it will never be the 4 of diamonds. By having the 4 of diamonds in your hand, you ensure the purity of that 4 out on the river. The other thing I would add here is that when you have a diamond, you eat up some of the outs in your opponent's range pertaining to their flush draw region. So if villain has a hand here like king 10 of diamonds, a very common turn bluff or semi bluff, we're going to be reducing its equity by removing one of the diamonds from the deck, reducing the flush outs from 9 to 8. It's not a huge deal, but it is enough to swing things when we have a bluff catcher, because as we know, bluff catchers are hands that beat all bluffs but no value bets, and these are typically on the fence between calling and folding. When we look at average versions of them, slightly better versions will be pure calls, and slightly worse ones like 4s no diamond will be pure folds. But it's important to understand that a hand like 6s is indifferent, but a hand like 4s is dependent on having the diamond. That's a really useful heuristic for finding your footing in this sort of spot. Question 4 is a bit more involved. We're going to rank the following hands from highest to lowest EV calls. This is the solution. The king-queen is, needless to say, the best call here. Not only does this hand have a wealth of implied odds, good pair outs, and some showdown value, but it also just has a very useful ability to win very big pots. This is the kind of hand that when your opponent bets the river, you can even jam for value. You can't say that about worse flush draws. So king-queen is huge. Its realization is just fantastic. Whenever it hits the river, it will have the best hand a ton and will make a lot of money. And whenever it misses, it will have the worst hand a ton, and thus we won't be squandering so much equity when we fold this hand. So good realization factor, good implied odds, good pair draws, showdown value already. What's not to love? King 7 of clubs is a little bit worse. It is useful to have the pair on the board. You may not even have this hand if you're not careful on the flop. Cutoff is range betting here, and that's the reason we get to continue this flimsy looking holding. And this hand is interestingly throwing in a little bit of raise. I said we wouldn't talk about raise today, but clearly this is a multi-purpose raise. We're getting some better hands to fold, some worse hands to call, and also getting some useful fold equity in the form of denial. This is the concept we've met already, but we have these multi-purpose or hybrid raises, and we'll talk a lot more about those in the lectures to come in this grade. Pocket 8s. This hand is much more robust than 6s. Obviously, it's just a higher pair. Villain will not have overcards to us when their bluff contains an 8, so this is much better. We may block slightly more bluffs than the 6s do, but just having the bigger pair just gives it a lot more EV, especially if villain is even value betting a hand like Ace 7, King 7 themselves, then we can think about this hand as more than a bluff catcher. The next tier of hand up when you're facing a bet from bluff catcher is of course value beater, and it's not really correct in GTO to ever pitch a hand that can chop or win against the value bet. Ace Queen offsuit is a hand that does much better than you would think. The pair draws are wildly good here. The showdown value is huge. There's a lot of domination possibilities that villain is just bluffing dominated cards like Ace 5, Ace 4, Ace 10, Queen 10, King Queen, etc. So hitting the river here can pay dividends because our opponent can value bet. We can raise on non-diamond pairing cards, sometimes depending on their sizing, or just call, and we can make more money. So Ace Queen is an implied odds drawing hand that's also robust enough to not need to bluff if it misses. 6s is a hand that we saw earlier was mixing, but with the diamond it's a pure call. It's entitled to 2.8 chips when we have the diamond, but 0 chips when we don't. Again, this is due to removing outs from diamond draws and also having a purer ability to hit a set that doesn't get tainted on the river. A little bit more on turn raising now. So let's say that we do make a 4x raise on the turn, which I think is a reasonable sizing. I don't think there's a need at this SPR to make a bigger raise than this. We're still bringing stacks into play and approaching the investment ceiling here when we have Jack 7 pocket 7s, which are going to be basically the be all and end all of our value region here. It's going to be a rare line. But the next thing we want to acknowledge is that we'll be raising hands with 85 to 90% equity. These are effectively tier 1 hands in the tier system that we introduced in the previous grade. If you didn't take grade 2, the tier system is simply a way of ranking hands from best to worst and also recommending whether they want to reopen the action for raises, make large investments or smaller ones, or simply check. By first mapping out that this value raising range is small, we can ascertain that we will need to be mostly calling with our mixes and only raising hands that prefer raise. The idea here is that if you start raising flush draws that actually don't mind whether they raise or call and you do it all the time, you're going to be over bluffing, even though those hands have quite a bit of equity, because the value raises in your range are so few and far between. When a hand is indifferent, if you reach that magical point where you're like, it doesn't matter what I do in a vacuum with this hand, and you want to play a strong strategy against a good observant opponent, which many of you will need to do at this grade, then you will want to use mostly call with a little bit of raise, because that's how you map it out to your range in order to stay balanced and unexploitable. Poker and EV are a lot to do with things that have nothing to do with balance. Your EV is mainly derived by just the raw equity of your hand and what happens when you take an action against your opponent's range. But when things are equal, that's where the luxury of balance comes into it. I like to teach my students that balance is something you get to do only if you don't prefer one line to the other. Otherwise, it falls by the wayside, and quite rightly so. Here are some guided questions for this spot. Firstly, what will be some hands that are indifferent to raising and calling? This time we're going to pause the video after each question, so have an attempt at this one. Assuming that you've done that, well, a few examples that I came up with here, or the solver came up with and I referenced, are Jack 9 of hearts, for example. This is quite surprising, right? What is going on here? When you have the top pair that has this low kicker, you're going to benefit a bit more from fold equity because your opponent's going to be bluffing 2 overcards, and getting that fold equity is going to be worth quite a lot. That's not the main reason for the raise. The other reason for this raise is that villain is probably going to be folding some better hands, believe it or not, because we're mostly reducing Jack X to just being a bluff catcher, as long as we do this very sparingly. And we'll be calling with some weaker hands too, maybe some 7x, 4-5, 8-9 of diamonds, hands like this, ace high diamond draw, queen high diamond draw, whatever. So this is a hybrid raise. Most people don't find this raise, but it's quite interesting to see that it exists. And you can find other examples here. I just wanted to point this one out because it's really cool. You can also raise with certain 7x combos here. You can raise with some draws here, of course, that have some showdown value, but not enough to consider themselves pure calls. So you wouldn't really raise with ace 10 of diamonds here, but you might raise with a weaker one like king 10. that can go either way, call or raise. Then when you get down to sort of king 4, you're probably just raising. What will be some hands that are indifferent to raising and folding? So basically 0 EV raises that could also fold. Pause the video, have a think. Assuming you've done that, I think this next batch of hands are quite likely to be something with high equity in the form of draw equity and decent implied odds in EV. Hands that are getting a good conversion from equity to EV due to having implied odds. But they'll also be hands that are a little bit flimsy, their draw's not that nutted, they lack showdown value. Hand that we might consider like this is 9-8. Not quite a flush draw, but certainly has enough going on that if we start bluff raising with it, we don't incur a big EV loss in equilibrium, provided that the fold equity is normal. Against the calling station, this raise is awful. If you think your opponent's incapable of folding top pair here because they just misevaluate how polarized your range is and the bluff catcher nature of that hand, you don't want to make this raise. However, against normal opponents, you want to throw this in from time to time because not only is it just fine, and so there's no reason not to do it at some frequency, but also your range needs to have hands like this that aren't diamond draws because you still want to have bluffs on diamond runouts. This is important. You don't only want to raise flush draws on this turn as bluffs. What I see people do too often here is only bluff raise with a flush draw and then get to the river on a diamond and just never have anything they can bluff with. Because of course they haven't raised enough mediocre hands that they could bluff either. They don't even have a 7 here because they missed that too. The hands that are indifferent to raising this turn, hands that mix raise on the turn, are not just obvious flush draws and sets. There's other stuff going on here too. Polarized raising ranges on the turn aren't just thick value in bluffs, there's a few different categories of raise. I'm going to talk more about categories of raise in lecture 3. Can you find a hand that will prefer bluff raising to all other options? This has to be something with more EV than 9-8, so it's no longer indifferent. And this also has to be something that doesn't have the showdown value to prefer calling. So we're looking at bad flush draws. Not bad flush draws, but showdown valueless flush draws or good straight draws without showdown value. I think the biggest illustrative example of this is the 5-4 of spades. This is a hand that has so much going on that it's a big mistake to fold. It's actually better to call than to fold with the 5-4 of spades. You might be thinking, what? But surely calling isn't plus EV. It is plus EV, but it's not the best play. Because being able to harvest fold equity as well with a 5-high hand is really important, and if you call you don't get to do that because we're not allowing river leads here. Not that they would be a great idea for range anyway. Overall, we have a hand that's doing way too well in EV to fold because the combination of its equity and implied odds and a little bit of pair draw showdown value outs just make it too good to fold. But it benefits extremely highly from fold equity. So try and remember that these high equity, low showdown value hands are going to be the first thing you want to raise in spots where you're facing turn c-bets. 5-4 of spades, really good case in point there. King 6 of diamonds, interestingly, a lower EV hand than the 5-4 of spades. This is quite bizarre. You would think that this hand was doing better. It does have more equity overall, and it is better to call than 5-4 of spades is to call, but this is also a pure raise. The reason that this hand's EV is actually lower than the 5-4 of spades is just that the 5-4 of spades is drawing to very nutted things with most of its outs, but none of King 6 of diamonds' outs are to the nuts. So that's an interesting point. When the river comes the 6 of hearts, the 5-4 of spades is a phenomenal holding. But when the river comes the 8 of diamonds, the King 6 of diamonds is going to lose massive pots from time to time. That's the main difference. That said, King 6 of diamonds is still going to be a pure raise here because it's got very high equity, quite low showdown value, and its draw is to quite a nutty holding, so building the pot in the form of gaining fold equity by raising is the right thing to do. If you make this draw a bit weaker, it may become closer to 0, but still a pure raise, and if you make the showdown value a bit bigger like King Queen, you're probably going to mix some call in with raise as well. How big a mistake would it be to raise a 7 of hearts? What do you think, guys? Large blunder, small mistake, or not a mistake at all? The answer, if you're ready for it, is not a mistake at all. Why is the solver hardly ever doing something that's not a mistake? Because it doesn't have the freedom to just raise whenever it wants here with these mediocre hands. If the solver was to lose the plot here with frequency and just raise this hand whenever it felt like it, villain would no longer be indifferent with hands like top pair. They would have very obvious continues. What we want to do is build a raising range which theoretically reduces the EV of our opponent's decent value bets to 0. The only way we can do that is to show some restraint with how often we raise certain bluffs and certain hybrid hands. A7 is not a hand that gains EV by raising. While there's a tiny gain there in favour of call, I'd like you to basically ignore that and put that down to noise and the accuracy of the sim. The main point here is that while this hand doesn't hurt itself in a vacuum when it raises, it would hurt our strategy to raise a hand like this too frequently. For one, it would just make you appear like a maniac, you'd have a super high turn raise c-bet spot, even though you hardly ever have that many good value hands to raise with on the turn, because they're few and far between, repolarizing, meaning you've got to be selective, and you've already raised your threes and deuces here on the flop. Very easy to lose control, and I think exploitatively speaking, this spot is overbluffed from the big blind's point of view as soon as villain reaches a certain level of aggression. Effectively, there are two player types in this spot that Cutoff will encounter. Big blind players, firstly, who do bluff raise, and those people will possibly lose control of their bluff raising. However, that will depend on whether they find any of these hybrid raises or low EV bluffs like 9-8. And then people who just don't really bluff raise much at all, and may even make the mistake of folding a hand like 5-4. There are some weak players here that basically just say, I'm priced out, I have to fold 5-4, because they're not thinking about raising, and they don't even understand how big the implied odds are of calling, or the fact that they can bink a 4 and still win. There's a bit more raising going on here overall than you may think. Let's talk a bit more about these hybrid raises now. So as we observed, we can raise a hand like Ace-7 of hearts without EV loss in this situation, but we wanted to do that rarely, because our range is fairly starved of value raisable combos. They're just deficient within our range. To understand this hybrid phenomenon more clearly, we can examine all three elements of villain's reaction to our 4x raise that makes this raise viable, i.e. as good as calling would be. Villain can be folding better hands here. It may come as a surprise that Ace-Jack is able to fold, in theory, to a raise on the turn. People have a very dangerously linear way of thinking about ranges in this spot sometimes, where they may cite a reason for continuing, such as Ace-Jack is far up my range. When you're raised by a villain who's representing for value, sets, and 2-pair, it doesn't really matter whether you have a jack or whether you have a hand like a 7, at least not in absolute terms. What might matter is the blocker value or how vulnerable these hands are to your opponent's bluffing range, but hierarchically speaking, Ace-Jack, King-Jack, Queen-Jack, Ace-7, pocket 10s, pocket queens, these hands are all really similar in hand ranking now, because the polarized range clobbers them with its value region, and they'll be beating the bluffs, or they'll be ahead of the bluffs. You have to be careful here before you actually work your way down your range in this linear way as Cutoff, and just say I call Ace-Jack because it's above Queen-Jack. You've got to think about removal effects. Secondly, villain can be calling with worse hands, so when we go ahead and make a hybrid raise such as this, a hand like the Ace-8 of diamonds is going to peel. What that means is that there'll be branches on the tree where we raise villain calls and then we check the river. And villain's thought process may go as follows, and in GTO, the play would go as follows as well. They may think, okay, I called Ace-8 of diamonds, then villain checked the river to me, and because villain's range is polarized mainly for raising the turn, that's to say that we're mainly raising hands like 4-5, plus straws, or big value bets, there's not a lot of point in villain betting the river with a hand like Ace-Queen of diamonds, Ace-8 of diamonds, Ace-King of diamonds, etc. These hands are actually going to check back a lot. So not only do we raise and get called by a worse hand, but we're also allowed to realize our equity against those worse hands on the river when it goes check check, and that's a really important part of the game tree. This is the value element. We talked about the betting sink in the Carrot Poker School Grade 2 Lecture 6, and the betting sink was the idea that we fill it up with different reasons for betting or raising, and there is some value element to this in that villain continues all of these hands we do well against. Villain is also potentially folding some live hands here. For example, one of villain's common theoretical bluffs in this spot is King-Queen offsuit, mostly with a diamond, and when this hand folds, while it's not the best thing in the world and it's not a sufficient reason in and of itself for raising, picking up that fold equity from those 6 outs is nevertheless a good thing to do, and we're going to be super happy with that. On the turn, the EV of hands compared to their absolute made strength is quite fluid, it's quite adaptive, and you can't just think about a hand as being higher up and therefore a value raise or lower down and therefore not a value raise. Hybrids exist, and they exist because of the very phenomenon that fold equity is useful before the river. On the river, fold equity is less useful when you have a medium hand because villain just folds generally worse hands and calls better. But on the turn, they can call with worse hands, they can fold better hands, and they can fold hands that are live as well, so it's really threefold. So that's what's going on here. This allows a player to call very low showdown value hands, because equity is just fluid like this. It's about improvability, not just showdown value. And also hold some very high equity ones, because Ace-Jack, as we saw, becomes a bluff catcher, because it loses to 100% of our value raises. Make no mistake, a hand like Jack-9, if we raise there, is not a value raise. It's a very occasional hybrid raise. Villain will lose to all of our value bets with a hand like Ace-Jack, King-Jack, etc. That's why those hands are not pure calls here. They're actually indifferent. And a little bit will depend on suits as well. Raising showdown value on the river. Back to this situation, big blind against Cutoff, Jack 3 deuce. We have a check call of a range bet. R33, remember, means betting all of their range. We check call as big blind, and the turn is the 7 of diamonds. It goes check call on B75, and then river goes check B75 and raise on the king of spades. Why is this entitled raising showdown value on the river? Surely raising showdown value is a weird thing to do. Well, actually, no. Here we're repolarizing. And just a quick bit of jargon, repolarize means to raise a bet, having condensed your range by calling an earlier one. On blankish runouts like this one, the correct raise candidates as a bluff will often be pairs. And this is down to what we're going to call interference theorem. We had a lot of theorems in previous grades of the Carrot Poker School, and today we're going to meet the first theorem for grade 3. Interference theorem is the idea that when you repolarize on the river, meaning your opponent has made a further polarizing action and you then raise, you're polarizing even more than they polarized, you're repolarizing, you want to bluff with pairs on blank runouts and flush or straight blockers on wetter runouts where flushes and straights are present. What do you think big blind's bluff raises are here, and how often would you mix them when you held one? What low showdown value hands would be bad bluff raises here? This is your quiz. I'd like you to pause the video, have a think about this, and when you're ready, we'll go over the answers. Okay, I'll assume that you have unpaused, and here are some of the answers. The Jack-8 of spades is a fairly good hand for raising here. The idea is that we have unblockers to villain's bluffing range. We definitely, although we beat villain's bluffs, we still want to run into them really frequently because they're going to fold and we want more fold equity. It doesn't really matter whether villain is folding a worse hand or a better hand, although clearly we need them to be folding some better hands to ever bother raising. But when they fold a worse hand than Jack-8, that's good too, because that's another time that we didn't run into their bet call range. And of course, when we're bluffing, like we are here, make no mistake, this is a bluff. The main objective is to not run into the bet call range. This EV difference is noise, that's just based on the accuracy of the sim here, whether we get 8.15 chips or 8.09. But the point is we get a bit more than folding, a bit more than zero, regardless of which investment type we make, and raising is permissible. The reason we only do it at a low frequency, and we're going to look at how to mix frequencies a bit more in a minute, but the reason we only do this at a low frequency is that we don't have a lot of value hands on this node. We have to have purposefully slow played a hand like pocket sevens or rivered a hand like king jack here, or king 7 of clubs or hearts that we floated flop with in order to actually have raises in this spot for value. So when your range is quite anemic when it comes to having enough value raises, you need to mix these raises in sparingly. Even when you have a good hand like this for raising, which blocks a lot of villain's bet calls, villain will want to bet call a jack a bit here, and it'll be mainly like king jack, maybe ace jack, something like that too. But the jack is going to be great because it blocks our king jack, so he'll want to bet call that at quite a high frequency. And 8 is going to unblock their bluffs because cutoff here doesn't have a lot of 8x combos that are bluffing the river. Maybe some 8, 9, 10, 8, but not loads. Much better to have an 8 than have something like a queen here. Another hand that we can raise and do raise really frequently is a hand like 4-3. When you have low cards, they're going to be great for actually blocking sets. Low pairs are going to interfere with the board in the sense that they block sets, which is really fantastic. But what they're also going to do is that this side card, the 4, is not going to be an offensive blocker to villain's bluffs particularly. And the reason for this is that our opponent is actually going to be going ahead and folding most 4x pre-flop. So while there are some ace 4 of spades, 4 5 of spades combos here, we don't see 4 5 off, ace 5 off, we don't even really see queen 4 suited in this position. So the 4 is kind of an innocuous card that doesn't interfere with bluffs in the same way that a higher card like a 9 10 queen or something like that might, or even an ace. But we wouldn't raise a hand like queen jack because although we have some interference here with the jack and that's a positive remover or blocker, the queen is a negative blocker. What the queen is really doing is removing combos of villain's bluffs, and that's not what we want to do. Note that pre-flop, the queen of hearts is just a prevalent card that villain will choose to open, barrel on the turn, and then bluff on the river. The villain has hands like queen 9, queen 10. These will be available in offsuit formats and not just suited ones, depending on how wide they're opening, and therefore that hand is much more negative to hold when you are considering bluff raising. Again, while you beat a hand like queen 10 here, it's still important to unblock it because that hand is not the nuts and will fold. You basically just want to block the nuts. So Jack 8 and 4-3 to summarize, really good interference theorem bluff raises because they block bet calls, the former by blocking 2 pair and a set of jacks, the latter by blocking the set of 3s, and they don't have side cards which interfere with the folding range like the queen jack does. So that's how we go ahead in GTO and craft a raising range on the river. I think exploitatively speaking, a lot of people forget to even build bluff raises here and they just end up always having king jack when they raise. That's something we want to avoid. We don't want to be the sheep in the herd of sheep. We want to be the wolf in sheep's clothing, the person that understands how to craft some bluffs here. That said, when you learn how to bluff here, the first thing that will actually happen in your game, take it from me because I've been there, is that you're going to overbluff. And the reason you'll overbluff is that your value range is very slight and it doesn't really afford you a high bluff frequency. This hand, do we see why this isn't good to raise? Hopefully we do. It's just based on this queen. Let's talk about grades of river bluff catcher when we face b75. We talked before in grade 2 about the idea that there are value beaters, hands which beat some value, and we always call these in GTO, against the bet. On the river, there are also bluff catchers which beat all bluffs but lose to all value, and we call some of these, depending on sizing and grade of bluff catcher, which is blocker dependent solely on the river. On the turn, it matters what kind of equity you have to redraw or be redrawn against on the river. That doesn't exist. And of course we have frail hands which don't beat some bluffs, and these just always have to be thrown into the muck, because not only do they lose to value, they also lose to some bluffs. So this is all revision. Back in grade 1, we introduced the concept of range geography. We go all the way back, and that was the idea of that when you've got some sort of concept of a threshold for calling or folding, you can build the rest of your strategy around it. This was locating key milestones in a range that can help us see the whole strategy of our range more clearly. When we face a triple barrel on a board like Jack 3 to 7 King, the river bluff catcher is going to be a hand which loses to the worst hand in villain's value betting range but beats every single bluff. Doesn't chop with a bluff, doesn't chop with value. Very clear. Villain's weakest value bet on this node for triple barreling is Queen Jack. I thought it might be Ace Jack because I couldn't quite remember. Been a while since I looked at these slides, but it was actually Queen Jack. And yeah, that makes sense because when the king comes on the river, the king is actually really absent from our range. If we don't have King 3, King Deuce, King 7, or King Jack, how are we actually just calling a bet with a king? Okay, we could maybe have King Queen of Diamonds, King 10 of Diamonds, but we don't have a lot of King X on this node. So it's actually safe for villain to go ahead and b75 Queen Jack here, and it's a blunder to check back, costing 6% of the pot. Some questions for you guys then. Firstly, can we identify some bluff catchers which are pure calls? This means hands that only beat bluffs and lose to all value, but are plus EV calls. These are grade A. Can we identify some bluff catchers which are close to mixed calls? If the solver pure calls a hand or pure folds a hand, but it thinks the EV difference is just tiny, we can ignore that and actually think of that as a mix. The reason it's important to do that is just that we don't want to be copying solver frequencies. We want to be learning where the EV starts to become positive or negative, and if that's only by a small margin, we don't have to worry about it, because in reality things will be a bit different anyway. And thirdly, can we identify some bluff catchers which are pure folds? That means they're grade C, and they're actually leaking money if they choose to call. I'll give you a few minutes, and when you're ready, unpause the video. So, we have this spectrum, going all the way from value beaters, hands that can chop or win against the value combo. Just one is fine, that's enough to deem the hand a value beater, and these will be calls. Then we have grade A, grade B, grade C bluff catchers, then we have a frail hand that just goes in the bin because it doesn't beat every bluff. The value beater here is Queen Jack, simply by virtue of the fact that we chop with Queen Jack. Of course, we can't have Queen Jack at the same time that they do, but that's okay. We're going to be chopping with other suits of it and also blocking some value bets. This hand is a profitable call. There's a very good rule in poker that we've discussed in the previous grade, and that is do not fold a value beater unless it's for an exploitative reason. A grade A bluff catcher here is something like Jack 9. The Jack is very promising at blocking a lot of villain's value bets. Villain is value betting not just two pair in sets relating to the Jack, like King Jack, Jack 7 suited, and pocket Jacks, but also hands like Ace Jack and Queen Jack. Therefore, when you remove a large number of your opponent's value bets and a small number of your opponent's bluffs, as you do with the 9, you're going to have on average positive blockers for calling. This is a nice call, although it is a bluff catcher. Ace 7 of hearts is another bluff catcher. There is no difference really in hierarchical strength between Jack 9 and Ace 7. You don't want to be committing, as we saw in grade 2, the linearization pitfall, where you work your way down your range like a robot and say this is above this, therefore I call this and not that. That's not the right way to think about bluff catching. Ace 7 then is a hand that actually has very positive blockers. The ace is being bluffed sometimes here for sure, like Ace 4, Ace 5 of hearts are following through. There aren't that many gutter aces in the offsuit region though, which is good, because offsuit hands are very abundant and we don't want villain to have a lot of them when we have an ace. So we're not blocking that many bluffs with the ace, but we are blocking some, and with the 7 we're undoubtedly blocking hands like King 7, Jack 7 suited, pocket 7s. It's not as positive a blocker as the Jack, and you'll see that the EV is therefore lower. The EV of calling the Jack is higher, because Jack 9 of hearts is just a hand that it's blocking a lot more value combos. It's blocking one pair. Villain isn't value betting one pair of 7s, so the 7 is a less abundant value blocker, but it's still good. This hand is slightly above break even, you'd maybe want to fold it against someone that's under bluffing. We should also point out for exploitative purposes that the cutoff, that's the aggressor here that's triple barreling, should be following through on the king river with pretty much everything that they bet the turn with. It didn't get there. Maybe not like the ace-6 of diamonds because that's got some SDV and also horrible blockers, but most hands are going to follow through. The villain has like 10-9 here, they're just going to go for it in GTO because the king is such a better card for their range than it is for big blinds. It's easy to underbluff here if you don't understand that. Back to theory, ace-deuce is a break-even call. While the solver is always calling this hand, it's not correct to see this hand as a pure call. That sounds confusing. I'd rather see it as a mix or as an optional call, because again, what I care about and what I like to teach my students about is EV and where the thresholds are where things swing, positive, negative, or break even. What I don't want to do is just have people copy strategies and say, solver calls here, so I call. This is a call, it's a mistake to fold. It's barely a mistake to fold. Look at the EV, 1/3% pop. Pocket sixes is a mix. You might think this hand's terrible. Why would I call with this? Well, the idea is that you don't really block bluffs with these cards. You don't block value either, but at least cutoff doesn't have a ton of bluffs containing a 6. A6 of diamonds probably won't bluff river. The 6-5 will, but it's only a couple of combos, so I don't think this is a terrible call. Generally speaking, when you reach the river with a bluff catcher, and the bluff catcher has neutral blocker properties and your opponent bets a normal sizing, you'll want to go ahead and mix, call with fold. A grade C bluff catcher is something like 5s. The problem with 5s is it blocks a lot more bluffs than 6s do, because it blocks not just 6-5 like the 6s do, but also 5-4 and ace-5. So this hand is the same caliber in terms of absolute showdown value as pocket 6s, but it blocks more bluffs. We're going to talk extensively later in this grade about how important it is to unblock your opponent's prevalent bluffs. In a frail hand like ace-5 of diamonds, it doesn't even beat a bluff like ace-5, therefore it's just going to be folding. You can see how the EV swings to being very negative indeed if we call this hand, and that's because we actually chop or lose to some bluffs as well as every value combo. You never fold a value beater and you never call a frail hand, and when it comes to your bluff catchers, you try and decipher which grade you have. This is based on unblocking your opponent's bluffs and blocking their value combos. Some tips for healthy mixing now to wrap up the video. Let's get a little bit more general. The mixing pitfall. This is a very common thing I see, and this tends to occur when we take an inferior EV action because the RNG told us to. What does this mean? The RNG told us to do it. Do harm to yourself, human, says the RNG when it rolls high, in a spot where you should never be betting. The pitfall here is to actually assume things are mixes when they're not. Whenever we learn a new skill, we over-apply it. That's just how humans are. We over-apply it and then we move back to the middle. It's like a pendulum. We're not doing it enough, then we're doing it too much. Then we're doing it just the right amount. In order to get to the sweet spot, the so-called Goldilocks zone of how often we should be mixing, what we need to be doing is actually working on the skill of ascertaining whether a hand is a mix or whether it's a pure action. To stay out of the blender, so to speak, always make sure that you're highly confident that a hand is a mix before you roll. If you're torn between a mix and one of the pure actions, then it's always safer and good practice to take the pure action that you're leaning towards. For example, if you don't know whether you can bluff raise the river, but you think that if it is a bluff raise, then it would only be a mixed bluff raise, you should just not do it until you've studied that spot a bit more. Because either you're doing something that's merely optional, or you're doing something that's a blunder. Why would you do something that might be a blunder that doesn't actually promise any EV? Doesn't make sense. Similarly, if you think that a hand is either going to be a mix or a call, you should never fold. Don't roll it and fold on a high number, or low number depending which way you are inclined, because then you're just committing a mistake some percentage of the time. If something is bad to do in poker, we never do it. We don't do it a low percentage of the time. Look at how few hands in this river spot are actually mixes between call and fold. I think it'll be less than you might think. Most hands are pure calls or pure folds, and some of these are only by a small margin, like the 6s with a diamond was, but that's okay. Many of these hands are clearly good or clearly bad to call. So before you fall back on mixing, and while this is a video about mixing, you want to try and figure out whether it's profitable first off to make the investment. It's only if you're confident that the investment is theoretically break even and you cannot come up with an exploitative reason to prefer one of the options, that's the only time you should mix. Look at this. How many pure actions can you see here? Lots. There's plenty of hands that are all green that are just having to make this call. How many pure folds can you see? Quite a few. How many mixes? Not many at all. You have pocket 6s, you have ace deuce, I'm struggling to find many other ones, maybe 4 deuce as well, which I haven't circled, but there will not be many hands here that are actually technically indifferent between calling and folding. Therefore, if you get to this spot with Jack 10 and you instantly defer to the RNG and it rolls a high number, which means fold this time, and you fold this time, you throw away money. Same thing if you mix a call with 8s. The RNG told me to. No, it didn't, because you're not allowed to consult the RNG when there's no call frequency allowed because calling is a mistake. You wouldn't roll a magic 8 ball in life and ask it whether you should do something stupid and detrimental to yourself. You would basically know not to do that thing. And if there's something really good for you that you had to do, like, I don't know, having a shower when you wake up or something that you just know you should do, you're not going to like randomize whether you do it. So we only randomize things when we don't care. It's like the equivalent of picking out a candy from a jar of candy that are all the same. That's random. We don't care. We randomize that because there's no EV swing between which candy we choose. Here there is with most hands. We have to be very vigilant and make sure that we've gone through the proper protocol of asking, what are my blockers like? What grade is my bluff catcher? Before we actually mix. Only if you're super stumped are you allowed to mix here. Back to the flop, and we'll talk about raising there a little bit. And tier 2, if you recall from grade 2, this was about our top pair decent kicker type hands usually on a texture like this that can be raised. Bigger your sizing, the less of these you're going to raise. The smaller your sizing, the more of them you're going to raise. And against a range bet, which is what we're facing here, not just a normal bet, but a bet with all of villain's range, we're going to raise more. Let's talk about this value range. We will of course have hands that are pure value raises. These will be our tier 1 hands like our sets. But for now, let's focus on the tier 2 raises against this R33. We'll be implementing what I call a human mixing system to do this. It's going to be a little bit complicated, but I think if you bear with me, you'll soon understand what we're doing here. The human mixing system is a way of approximating things and maybe using language and semantics instead of numbers to express how often we raise. Let's place our non-pure raises into 3 buckets, and we'll focus on our top pair type stuff today when we're doing this. And use only 3 adjectives instead of 100 numbers. It's much more simple. We're humans, we're not solvers. Numbers don't matter, let's scrap them. We can have hands that are raised infrequently, and that can mean whatever, 20%, 15%, 30%. It doesn't really matter. There's no magical poker god in the sky handing down money to you if you hit the right frequency that the solver was doing. The solver's not going to come to your house and congratulate you for having a 42% raise frequency. Nothing good will happen by getting the frequency right. Why do we bother with frequencies then? Because we want to play a roughly unexploitable game. We don't want to be never raising low EV bluffs because we know those are hands we have to raise. Something like Queen 10 of diamonds here, for example. But we don't want to do it all the time because either lapse would make us exploitable. Raised sometimes, this can mean 50%, 40%, 30%, whatever you want. Raised frequently, this can mean 75, 80, 90, 60. I don't really care. You get the point. I'm not trying to be precise with frequencies because they don't matter. Not exactly. A hand that we would raise infrequently here would be a top pair, reasonable kicker with a backdoor. Without the backdoor, this would be a bit more dubious. But there's a few different things going on here. We do actually want to get called by backdoor draws as well. So having the 8 of hearts here is in some sense good because we can make flushes, but in another sense bad because we'd like to get called by the ace 8 of hearts. Hands that are raised sometimes could be something like Jack 10. This is a bigger jack without the backdoor, so it actually unblocks some 10x of hearts and clubs that could float here. Queen 10 of spades, King 10, Ace 10 of hearts, etc. unblocked by having the 10 of spades here. That's actually a good thing, and the slightly bigger kicker just makes the hand a bit more... I want to say that our range can tolerate its presence more frequently. That's what's going on. If we were to add tons and tons of Jack 8, we would do more imbalance to our range than adding tons of Jack 10, because our range is roughly polar. We don't want to add loads of medium strength hands. Although, I wouldn't call Jack 8 medium, it's kind of good. Then once we get up to a hand like King Jack, we just raise frequently. How important is this? Not very. In a vacuum, it doesn't matter. If you just call Jack 10 in a vacuum, that's fine. If you raise King Jack, it's fine. If you raise Jack 8, it's fine. It doesn't matter what you do. But what matters here is long-term just having a reasonable strategy. So if, for example, you never raised King Jack but raised Jack 8, your raising range would be just way too weak and your opponent would be able to over-continue against you, especially with like King Queen and stuff like that that has overs to Jack 8 but not King Jack. So it's important long-term to have the right shape of range against observant opponents in high visibility games. And what you don't want to do is exhibit the same leaks that pool exhibits. For example, if you play 50NL online and someone raises you on the flop here, they probably don't have enough Jack 10 or Jack 8, but they might have enough King Jack. That would be what I would expect. So you don't want to inadvertently just fall into imbalances that mirror the imbalances that your fellow poker players are making there, because the astute, aware regs will be ready to exploit those imbalances. One final slide before I show you some homework for this week. So the same thing can be done with bluffs, just as we saw with our thin value raises. Ace 3 of clubs, for example, this is a hybrid hand, and this can do the same thing. When you have a hybrid hand, you usually just want a little bit of raise. The reason that Ace 3 here is going to make a decent raise is that the 3 is a very low pair. This makes the hand vulnerable, it makes the fold equity we garner much more useful than that we would get with something like 8s or 9s, and therefore these hands will raise but pocket 8s won't. Generally, although against range bet, it can be a bit tricky. Can you find a bluff raisable hand for each of these mixing buckets below? Pause the video and have an attempt. Can you find a hand that's raising as a bluff primarily, occasionally, as a bluff primarily at some frequency, and as a bluff primarily at a higher frequency? Queen 8 of hearts. This is a pretty good one for raising occasionally. The idea is that if you load up your range with these combos, you can also call this, by the way, against range bet. Shocking, right? But you have pair draws as well as your straight draws and flush draws that are backdoors. Hitting the queen, hitting the 8, don't disregard these points. They're subtle, but they're important. And this one can raise because it benefits a lot from fold equity. It's got enough going on. Favorability-wise, this is the bad world for your range. It's a negative world. Your range is entitled to less of the pot than your opponent's, and that means you have to have some standards here about what you're actually raising. You can't raise Queen 8 of spades, for example, because you'll unblock your opponent's continues and you'll have less equity. But you can raise this hand. You don't want to take that too far though and say, I need a front door draw that's to a straight or better to raise. That's just not true. Hand that's raised at some frequency though is the Queen 6. This hand has more backdoor straight draws than the Queen 8 in the low vicinity here, and it's going to unblock your opponent's folds more. Think about this. Your opponent has more Ace 8 offsuit than Ace 6 offsuit, because they don't open Ace 6 on the cutoff, but they might open Ace 8. Your opponent has hands like 8 9 here, but they may not have hands like 8 6 here. When we think about having an 8 or a 9 relative to having a 6, we can get away with more 6-6 raises, i.e. we don't become exploitable as quickly by adding those to our range, because our opponent has more folds that are unblocked by the 6 than they do that are unblocked by the 8. Kind of a finer point, but definitely worth understanding. And then raise frequently would be like your classic high EV front door hand like 5-4. An important final point here is that it's not better to raise 5-4 than to raise Queen 6. 5-4 is a better hand than Queen 6, whatever you do, but in equilibrium you're indifferent to raising each of them. The EV is the same. In reality, one line will be better than the other, but we don't always know what that is, and so mixing is a good way of keeping our range in check. The way to understand the incline in frequency here as we move from Queen 8 of hearts through to 5-4 of clubs is to comprehend the notion of what your range can get away with. In spots that aren't great for your range, while you can get away with adding quite a lot of high EV draws to your strategy when you're being aggressive, you can't get away with adding lots of low EV draws. You won't become very exploitable by always raising 5-4 of clubs, but you'll become really exploitable if you always raise hands of the ilk of Queen 8 of hearts. Hope that makes sense. Homework task 1. So big blind versus cutoff here, and the flop's King Queen 7, cutoff range bets, which is common, and big blind has a decision. If you have access to a trainer, and I hope you do at grade 3, that could be a universal trainer that's online in a browser that you can use, subscription service for example, or it could be a drill that you're setting up in something like PioSolver or GTO Plus or Custom Solver, and train it 50 times, like literally train facing this c-bet 50 times. And practice. Make sure you've locked your opponent to bet range if possible, although they should be betting most of their range anyway if you give the solver free rein here. Firstly, I'd like you to compose a list of where you made the most common mixing errors. So mixing errors occur when you do something at the wrong frequency, like massively. So you should have a buffer here, so if it's like 2% out, it shouldn't matter. But if you're raising a hand 80% of the time and the solver's only doing it 20% of the time, then that's a mixing error. It's not the end of the world, it's only colored yellow by most solvers because it's not like you drop EV immediately. But long term, you're playing a more exploitable strategy. That's the problem. Secondly, I'd like you to compose a list of any EV losses you made. This is actually where you raise a hand or fold a hand or call a hand that you shouldn't do that with. For example, if you called this flop c-bet with the Jack 6 of clubs, it would be an EV loss because that's a minus EV call. And folding is therefore better at 0 EV. And thirdly, name the thing in-game you, the in-game version of you, has to be more cognizant of. What is it you're doing wrong in-game? What are you constantly forgetting? What's the pattern here that you want to fix? I think this will be a useful task. Even if you don't do it 50 times, try and do it, 20 times. Ideally do this a lot. Even do this for different textures, but I'd love to hear what you guys think about this exercise after you've completed it. So, feel free to get in touch with me or go up on a stream or something and let me know what you thought. Alright guys, this has been lecture 1 of grade 3, and I will see you for lecture 2 where we're going to talk about more mixing, but we're going to be mixing bet and check. So we're not going to be facing a bet, but we're going to have the chance to make one. See you then. Bye for now.